Next session is starting. We are very grateful to welcome Mark Murphy from Georgetown to our campus, to our conference. He's going to be presenting his paper, Owing God Worship.
Thank you all very much. Thank you very much for having me here, and thanks, of course, to the organizers. It's a big pain to organize conferences, and it's a real generosity on their part, act of love to philosophy and to the participants to take that on. So I'm very happy to be here to talk to you all. So my topic today is about owing God worship. And the big question that I'm going to be thinking about today is, do we by nature owe God worship, right? And if we don't owe God worship by nature, whatever that question turns out to mean, is there some other way in which we owe God worship, and is that a sort of a plausible view to have about the relationship between us and God and worship? So here's what I'm going to do. The handout, which should be out there, it just tracks the PowerPoint slides. So here's what first thing we're going to be trying to get clear on the question, trying to get clear on what I mean by stuff like by nature and God and owing stuff, and then I want to talk about some reasons to be non-skeptical about some normative propositions in the vicinity of, at least sort of in the ballpark of, our owing God worship by nature. Okay. The reason I need to talk about this is that there have been lately a great deal of skepticism expressed and arguments offered against the idea that we stand in various normative relationships to God with respect to worshiping. So I need to say something about that. And then I want to talk about reasons to be skeptical that we owe God worship by nature. And then I will talk about how we can owe God worship and why we shouldn't be bothered by the view that we contingently owe God worship. Right. So you get sort of the overall flow. The overall flow is like, I want to say that there's a way in which you might think that we owe God worship, that it's sort of just as a matter of course, by nature. I'm going to deny that. But what I want to say is that we do owe God worship, or at least many of us do owe God worship, contingently. Some people think that's kind of a fallback position or sort of a come down or something in some way unfortunate. But I want to say no, it's not unfortunate. It's actually a really attractive view, and I want to try to make clear what the attractions of the view are. Okay, so start by getting clear on the question. So I need to say something about God and worship and by nature. First thing. So by God, I'm just going to stipulate this for the discussion today. I'm an Anselmian about God, and in this case, in the context of this talk, it really matters. Okay, so it's not just lip service to Anselmianism. It's just, this is actually going to make a difference to the argument that I present, that God's perfection is absolutely unqualified, absolute, maximal. There are distinctions you can make between God being greatest possible being or maximally great or absolutely. It's not going to matter, I think, for the talk. But God has to be understood in an Anselmian way in order for some of the arguments of the talk to go through. So that's the first thing. Second thing, worship. So I'm not going to try to give some really, really well worked out conception of what worship amounts to, okay? Except I want to say something like the following, that what worship amounts to is something like a set of attitudes and actions, right? And what these attitudes and actions express and thus presuppose are facts about the value of the being worshipped and facts about the relative superiority of the worshipped over the worshiper. Okay, so the thought is that there's something. One way of getting at this, just really, really roughly, is that there's something super paradoxical about literally saying you worship a being, but you recognize that being is not all that great, right? Or saying you worship a being, but that being's just not much better than you are. Maybe just that seems not right. It seems like when worshiping action and worshipful attitudes are present, the thought is they sort of presuppose, at least if they're to be apt, a large gap in value between the worshiper and the worshipped, and that the worshipped is sort of, a very, very high, is very, very great. Okay. Third, by nature. So what I mean by nature is something like this. I don't think this is going to matter all that much for the talk, but by nature, I simply mean that if some normative state of affairs holds by nature, that means it holds in the characteristic circumstances of action for beings like us. Okay, so maybe I'm going to allow that something might not be true by something might be true by nature, but it might fail to hold in deeply, deeply wild and unusual circumstances, deceiving demons and so forth. Right, but the idea that it's in the standard issue circumstances of action for us humans, the idea is that the normative state of affairs will hold. What's more, I had this sort of non-imposition constraint on it. So any sort of norm that has to be added to the normative scene by some sort of authority, right, whether laid down by God or by the law or self-imposed by way of a promise or commitment or something like that, I'm going to count that as not true by nature. Okay? So what I'm asking then, right, so the question, understood this way, the question is it true, right, that by nature, right, we stand in the normative state of affairs obtains. We owe God worship. Okay, that's what I want to know. I want to know whether that's true. Okay, all right. So let me talk about. I want to start by talking about some normative states of affairs regarding our worship of God that I think are actually different from owing God worship. Okay, and they're states of affairs to which people have shown a great deal of attention over the last 40, 50 years. There's been sort of a recent surge of attention, given some recent writing by Bain and Nagasawa on the issue. Okay, so suppose you ask the question, it's like, there are various ways that we could stand with respect to worship of God, right? So one thing you might just say, and this is what I take to be like the weakest thing you could say, look, this sounds really weak, and it is. It's like, we have reason to worship God, okay? There's like a good, and by reasons I mean normative or good reasons. We have good reason to worship God. That's one state of affairs we might talk about. Here's a second one. God is worthy of our worship, okay? God is worthy of our worship. That seems like another normative state of affairs that we might affirm. We might also affirm a couple of states of affairs about the reasonableness, right, overall reasonableness of our worshiping God. One might say, for example, that it's reasonable for us to worship God. That's a reasonable thing for us to do, to have those attitudes and perform those actions. Or we might say it's unreasonable for us not to worship God. The worship of God is somehow, I'll put it somehow this way, some people might distinguish by saying is rationally required. Okay, the worship of God is something that it would be unreasonable for you not to engage, not to have these attitudes, and not to perform those actions. And finally, there's other state of affairs, which is like we're obligated to worship God. Okay, that we're under some sort of obligation to do so. Now, what's interesting about all of these, well, maybe with the exception of the obligation one, which I'm going to treat as kind of a special case, is that it's kind of plausible to state, I don't know if it's right to think of these as analyses, but you can describe these theses just in terms of the notion of a reason for action, I think. Okay? Some people think this involves giving an analysis of these notions. I don't know about that. But when I talk about, so the thought would be like you could ask, whether by nature we have reason to worship God, that's the minimal notion. Some people put it this way, when you ask about whether or not God is worship worthy, you sometimes put it this way. The question is whether or not we have reasons of the right kind to worship God, right? So the thought is that when a being is worthy of worship, it's not just that you have some reasons to worship that God, right? Worship that being. The thought is that they have to be of a distinctive sort, okay? Not just any reason to worship God is going to count as a reason that would make God worship worthy, okay? If my employer offered me a hefty bonus if I were to worship some being, that might give me a reason to do it. Probably not a very great reason. It'd give me a reason to do it, but it wouldn't do anything to make that being worthy of worship, okay? The thought is that the reasons that are involved have to be of a certain kind. Unsurprisingly, reasons having to do with the intrinsic greatness of the being and the gap between us, okay, that's what would have to be in place for God to be worthy of worship. We can also put these claims about reasonable worship, unreasonable not to, in terms of the language of reasons. We can talk about whether we have adequate reasons to worship God, whether the reasons are good enough to make it reasonable, right? And we might ask whether they're in fact decisive, okay? Where a decisive set of reasons is enough to rule out any alternative as being somehow an unreasonable thing to do, okay? So these are all sort of normative states of affairs we might think of different strengths. They make different demands in terms of explaining them. The last one that I had up there, this sort of obligated to worship God, it's unclear exactly how this stands in relation to these other talk about reasons. Some people want to say, I'll give some ideas about this a little later on, nothing original, just talking about some ideas. But the idea is that some people think you can characterize obligation just, again, sort of just giving further specifications on the kind of reasons involved. Others don't. Some think it's a different kind of thing. I'll say something about that a little later in the talk. Okay, so here's the thing. So suppose we take these normative states of affairs that I've described, and I think this is kind of, these give at least like equivalence conditions for them. This is what it is to show that God's worship worthy, or what is reasonable to worship God, or unreasonable not to worship God, and so forth. You might think all these are like, at least if you're a theist, you might think these things are like obviously the case, right? Of course we've got reasons to worship God, and God's worship worthy, and so forth, right? But the thing is that there's been like skeptical arguments made, right? by folks who basically said, look, even taking theism sort of for granted for the sake of argument, right? There's still, you can exhibit some kind of incoherence in the idea that God is worthy of worship, or we can show there's some sort of gap, right? Showing that we're unable to show that the worship of God is obligatory or perhaps even rationally required, okay? So that's James Rachels. He gave a famous argument in God and Human Attitudes, saying there's something about about what's constitutive of worship, that it's impossible for beings like us to be, it's impossible for God to be worthy of our worship. Bain and Nagasawa have argued that it's just not possible, there's no extant account of why it's true that, that worship of God is rationally required. Okay, so there's been like some skeptical sounds made here. If you're wondering sort of why I'm kind of going on about this for a little bit, which I'm going to be doing before I talk about Owing, the reason is I think that I think we can give a kind of non-skeptical response to a lot of these, with respect to a lot of these challenges to these normative states of affairs regarding worship of God. Right. So I just want to sketch the account that I favor for these things, right? Not because this is like my main topic today, because my main topic today is owing God worship. But the main thing is that unless we kind of have this sort of non-skeptical view sort of taken seriously as like the background, I think the stuff I'm going to say about owing is a little less interesting and a little less important. So I'm going to try to give you some reasons why maybe we shouldn't be so skeptical, right? That even in the face of arguments like Rachel's and Bain and Nagasawa's, that we can kind of be comfortable with the idea that worship of God is not just something we have reasons to do. God's not just worship worthy, but maybe even all the way up to our having obligations to worship God. Okay. Here's the thought. The thought is that if what's constitutive of worship, right, are various attitudes and actions, right, then maybe the way that we should try to explain these sort of normative states of affairs regarding worship of God is a kind of divide and conquer strategy. Okay, let's start with the attitudes. Let's think about the way in which we can have reasons to have certain kinds of attitudes toward things, and see from there whether or not we can, and then go on and ask whether or not the relevant actions also are reasoned back in the right ways. Okay, so here's the thought. This is the sketchy view. I think that Bain and Nagasawa don't take seriously enough. It hasn't, or don't really consider. It hasn't shown up in the literature as a response to them, and it's the one that I want to endorse. So the thought is that, look, here's a datum. Maybe they can always deny the datum, but here's what strikes me as a datum, right? That attitudes can be fitting or unfitting with respect to their objects. Okay, so there's like a handout right in front of me, right? And if my attitude toward it is fear, okay, that's an unfitting attitude for me to have with respect to that handout. Okay, I shouldn't be afraid of the handout. Okay, if I'm hearing some news of some horrible tragedy, right, that just happened, and my response to it is wry amusement, okay, that's an unfitting response for me to have to that news, to that horror. Okay, and again, if you don't take that as a datum, everything else is going to leave you cold from this point forward, right? Because the thought was like, look, it's true that in some cases our reasons for having various attitudes are just like the strategic role that they play in our lives, right? Sometimes not being willing to pay a certain price for a car might be strategically important in getting me a better deal on the car. But when we ask, right, why is it fitting for you to have why is it fitting for you to have a horrified reaction to the horror, right, rather than wry amusement, or to not be afraid at all of the handout rather than afraid? The thought might just be that's just inappropriate to its object. It does not fit. Okay. So, and the thought is that if you sort of take for granted the idea that our attitudes can fit or fail to fit their objects, then you could say, not just that some attitudes are fitting with respect to we have some adequate reason, right, to have those attitudes, right? But we might also, like in the case of of what my attitude is toward the horror, which is being horrified of it. But we can also think that some attitudes are such that it would be unreasonable to fail to have that attitude toward that object. Okay, so if I'm behind a fence and my child is on the other side of the fence, I can't get to my child. My child is about to be devoured by an angry animal, a wild beast. I ought to be afraid. I mean, it's like, and that's the appropriate attitudinal response for me to have in those circumstances. If you say, if you aren't afraid, right, maybe you'll do better in rescuing. It's like, that may be true, but that doesn't mean I don't have reason to be afraid. Okay, that I should be afraid, right? Maybe there are other reasons not to be afraid. Like I'd be more effective if I weren't. Nevertheless, that attitude totally fits, right, that situation, right? And it strikes me as it would be unreasonable for me to fail to have that response to the situation. Similarly, it's like if you've been working for 10 years on a massive philosophy project requiring huge resources, a deep scholarly thing, you've been up to your neck in horrible medieval texts. It's like it's really hard and complicated, and you've succeeded, you've broken through. It's like and you fail to take joy in that. You're failing to have an attitude that's appropriate to the object. Okay, and again, so the thought is that if you sort of take for granted the idea that attitudes can be fitting or unfitting with respect to their objects, right? That can make those appropriate, can make them fitting for you to have, and sort of ratcheting things up, right? They can make it overall reasonable for you to have the attitude, or in fact even required for you. There'd be some sort of failure in you. You'd be failing to get the situation or appreciate the object if you didn't have the attitude. Then you're sort of on board with what I'm saying here. Okay, so that's what I'm sort of taking for granted, that attitudes sort of have this kind of fittingness feature. But the thing is that, look, so here's the argument. It's an a fortiori argument, right? It's like, look, if what makes your attitudes, right, fitting or unfitting with respect to certain objects is always, nearly always, something about the value or disvalue, right, present in the object or the state of affairs, right? You're afraid that your child's life is in danger, right? Or whatever, right? You're taking joy in the great good of your project being achieved. Well, look, the attitudes that are constitutive of worship take God, an absolutely perfect being, as their object. Okay? The thought is that if any attitude, right, if any attitude can be rationally required of you, right, then the attitudes that are constitutive of worship are rationally required with respect to God, okay? Because God is the absolutely perfect being, all value is realized in God, and so forth. Every other sort of partial value that we can respond to is somehow already comprehended in God to a maximal degree. All right, so the thought is like, look, it's this absolute greatness of God and the sort of gap between our value and God's that make these attitudes unreasonable to fail to have, right? So the first thought is that the first idea is that if you want some idea about how to defend the rational requiredness of the attitudes that are constitutive of worship, what you just look to is the general feature of attitudes. The fact is that you have reason to have attitudes that are fitting to their objects, and God being absolutely great, that explains why we ought to have those attitudes. Okay. Actions are a different question. So if you say, well, what about the actions that are constitutive of worship, right? Say bowing down or other attitudes that you might think are sort of conventional expressions of worshiping. Why is it that we have very, very strong, maybe even decisive reason to engage in those? I don't know the right way to think about this, but let me offer like two possibilities. So one strategy is like there are actions that are constitutive of worship, and they have their requiredness just derivative from the rational requiredness of the attitudes, right? You might say it's because things like bowing down or whatever, right, are naturally flow from, right, the dispositions, the attitudes that are present in worship, right? Those that involved in of awe and wonder and respect, adoration, right, that come with worship naturally express themselves in various kinds of actions, and that's what makes these actions of worship rationally required. Okay, this doesn't always work with attitudes and actions, right? The fact that you're rationally required to have the attitude doesn't always make it true that the actions that flow from them are also rationally required. There are famous kinds of counterexamples to this, but usually they're counterexamples because they're not counterexamples when the attitudes are fitting to the objects. They're attitudes that are sort of strategically had in order to bring about some result, right? So the thought is that in these kinds of cases, in these kinds of cases where it looks like the action of bowing down or whatever flows from the attitude, you might think because the attitude is rationally required, the actions that flow therefrom are required as well. That's one strategy. I don't know whether I accept that. Here's another. So basically, I accept that this junction. One of these seems plausible to me. So it's like. So here's another way to think of it. It may be that what's primary is actually the expressive action itself, right? It may be that one way of thinking about what makes action rational. one way that action can be made rational is by promoting the good, by bringing value into existence. Another way is by giving adequate expression to that value, even if you can't bring it about, right? So we might think that it's important to somehow, even when we can't do something to bring about some good, we're doomed to be ineffective, or it's out of our reach, or whatever. The thought is that we somehow have very, very good reason to express that value in our action, even though we can't bring it into existence. So we wear black at funerals, and there's that great picture where the guy refuses to give the Nazi salute in like the big shipyard, wherever. It's like, why is he not giving? It's like, because he's refusing to express support of something so evil, right? So that even though it has nothing to do with promoting the good, nevertheless that action might be something that a very, very strong reason to do. And so the thought would be that maybe the right sort of idea is not to say that because we have the attitude, the action that flows from them is required. Maybe the thought is, no, what's primarily required is the actions, right? The actions that express the value of the absolutely perfect being. And the attitudes, basically, in a way, are just the disposition to perform those actions and to have sort of associated esteem and appreciation for the value of the absolutely perfect being. So there's the thought. So it's like, the idea is that we don't need in thinking about the sort of the rational requirements of worship, right? The thought is like what we should appeal to is the value of the absolutely perfect being, the difference between that being and us, and so what's required to express that being's value in action. All right, so that's a way of trying to say something about like why it's like there's reason to worship God, why God is worship worthy, why it's reasonable to worship God, why it might be unreasonable not to. What about obligation? Okay, this is kind of, I think, a more difficult question because some folks have emphasized that there could be a gap between the idea of rational requirement and obligation. Okay, some might think, for example, that maybe you're rationally required to do things that are efficient or effective for bringing about your own good, but you might not think you're obligated to do so. There are other kinds of gaps that folks have pointed to. But I think that, again, this is something I just want to sort of sketch a kind of sketch sort of solution to. The idea is that the people have noted sort of two kinds of gaps with respect to rational requiredness and obligation. So one worry, and this comes up in the example I just gave of like rationally required pursuit of self-interest and obligation. You might think there's certain kinds of basically, you might think that in order to be obligated to do something, it's not just that you're rationally required to do it, but again, it's one of these right kinds of reasons argument, right? That is, there has to be a certain kind of value that you're responding to, right? There's a certain kind of good that you must respond to in performing the action for it to count as obligatory, right? So you might think, for example, that it has to be someone else's good, right? Or some good that's recognizable from an impersonal point of view or something like that, right? So in a way, I just want to say, fine. Maybe that's like the correct view. If that is the correct view, though, it strikes me that we shouldn't worry about whether or not worship meets that condition, right? Because the value that we're responding to is the good of a person, okay? The value of a being it's not a matter of you're not having the attitude in order to promote your own self-interest. You're responding to some great good, the good of some perfect person, right? And conforming your action in light of that value. So I don't think that I would worry too much about moving from the rational requiredness of worship to obligation. In virtue, worry about the kinds of reasons. It strikes me that the kinds of reasons are just the kind of reasons that one would expect to be relevant in cases of if reasons, in fact, are enough to generate obligation. Here's another one, though. So there's been a big move to sort of say that no, there's something about obligation that's really interestingly different from other kinds of rational requirements. The idea is that when obligation is present, it's not just that the agent has really good reasons to do something, super strong, even decisive reasons, right? The defenders of this view say what's crucial to obligation is that there's someone who has standing to hold you accountable for not acting in accordance with the rational requirement. Okay, and I used to be kind of down on this view, but it's sort of, I feel it more now. So the thought is like, so you kind of hear this, you give arguments for why you have very, very strong reason to do something. It's like, yeah, but do I really have to, right? It's like, well, in a sense, yeah, you have to because you have every reason. Reasons are decisive. You can't give an adequate reason not to. But in some sense, you don't have to because maybe no one's going to hold you accountable for it. maybe no one has standing to hold you accountable for it, right? And these might be the cases in which we might say, even though there's some rational requirement, there's no obligation for you to do this, right? So one might think, so how's that relevant here? Like the thought is like, even if you were to this is what Bain and Nagasawa, I think, are sort of pointing to, even though I don't think they're adequately explicit about this. It's like, even if you could show there are like decisive reasons to do this, how do you show that it's obligatory to worship God, right? Isn't there that sort of gap there? And I guess my thought is that, if you think about the various kinds of gaps that people have pointed to explain why rational requirement doesn't give rise to obligation in some cases, I don't think we need to be all that worried about it with respect to worship of God, right? So like the worries would be something like, well, is there anybody who has the standing to hold you to this, right? Well, what would stand in the way? Well, maybe it would stand in the way if maybe there's some kinds of actions that no one has standing to hold you to it because it would involve like nosy interference in your life, right? So maybe there's some things you really, really ought to do, but no one has no one has the standing to hold you to it because for them to do it, they would have to know a lot about you, right? They would have to have the right kind of character to be able to hold you to it and so forth. You might think, maybe there's some actions to which no one has that sort of standing. Maybe certain kinds of charitable giving, right? Maybe you have rational requirements to engage in them, but maybe no one has a standing to hold you accountable. Maybe, right? I don't think that's true in the case of worship, right? I just think there's no reason to think sort of in general, I think, that we should think that maybe God knows you enough, right, and knows enough about how to hold you accountable in ways that would not too much undermine your autonomy or would count as sort of too much nosiness or whatever, right? Or you might think that in some cases the reason why there's no rational requirement is that there's no obligation is because it's so demanding what your reasons are telling you to do that nobody could in good conscience hold you to it. It's so hard for human beings to engage in it, right? So you might think that, so this is like, some people say this is like the best explanation of supererogation, right? So even if like you have decisive reasons to go save, right, the people from the fire in the house, it's like, maybe because that would involve so much risk to your life that really we don't want to say that's obligatory, right? We don't think anybody has standing to hold you to it, even if that's what the strongest reasons point you toward doing. Again, I don't know that that's true in the worship case. I mean, even if it's true that worship is sort of, I'll come back to this later. Even if worship is something that can be super, super, super demanding, right? It's a good question sort of how strong the reasons are and how much of your life would be absorbed by worship if we took these reasons seriously enough. That doesn't show to me that there's no obligations to worship. What it might show is that those obligations are less than what the rational requirement is, right? Maybe it just shows that maybe no one has standing to hold you to all the worship that you should be engaging in, right? Maybe no one has that kind of standing, but it probably wouldn't show that it's in no way obligatory for you. All right. Now, so I've been talking about this for a while, and it's in a way I've been going on too long. In a way, it's been sort of too brief because this isn't like my main plausible arguments that the gap can be filled. Because this isn't like the main thing I want to talk about. Right? So if you've bumped into the worship literature, you've seen this primarily devoted to dealing with these sort of skeptical worries about these kinds of normative states of affairs. But I've been trying to give you reasons why I'm sort of taking all that for granted as the background. Okay, I do believe that we have reasons to worship God and that God is worship worthy, and it's not unreasonable to worship God, and it's rationally required to worship God, and in fact that we have an obligation. I believe all that stuff. Okay, so that's why when I'm skeptical about this next thing, it's not because my skepticism has like dribbled over from these other things, right? It's like, no, I believe all this other stuff, right, all the way, but I'm going to tell you what I don't believe. Okay, that actually puts it too strongly. That I'm really shaking on. That I'm, you know how putting it more boldly than I really mean it. But that's the way philosophy talks. So it's like I want to give you reasons to be skeptical about this other normative state of affairs. Okay, and we'll get to this. It's related to some. So Mike was referring to this stuff early on. It's about the notion of bipolar normativity, dyadic, questions of dyadic moral norms. I'll try to give you some idea what I have in mind here. I don't think it's very hard to give an analysis of this, and nobody really has a good one. But I think you'll kind of see what I'm talking about as I go to talk about it. Right? So here's what seems to me to be a distinctive normative state of affairs. Okay, it's distinct from having reasons to worship God. It's distinct from God being worship-worthy. Even distinct from our having an obligation to worship God. Right? What is it? The idea of our owing God worship. Okay, this is a different thing, right, than any of the things that I've talked about so far. So I'm going to treat this as equivalent to our having a duty to God to worship God. All right? So I'll use these sort of notions interchangeably. I'm talking about duties to God and owing God and so forth, right? Okay, so there's Michael Thompson. Mike was referring to him earlier in his talk. So we can talk about, so consider these two locutions. X did wrong in doing A to Y. X has a duty to do A to Y, okay? And so in both these cases, let's get close. In both these cases, there's an agent and a patient. X is doing something to someone else, okay? A, whatever A is, right? Okay. But Thompson's point is that, in these kinds of cases, the role that Y serves is, we might call it, simply as the direct object of X's action, right? It's the being that X will affect by doing what X has a duty to do, okay? And the thought is that this is different from the claims that X wronged Y in doing A, and X has a duty to Y to do A. Okay. So look, I mean, here are just some examples to show that this is. So it's like, look, I might do wrong in defacing the Mona Lisa. Okay. That doesn't mean I owe it to the Mona Lisa, right? Not to deface that painting. Okay. You might say, oh, that's okay, fine. So in all these cases, so. Fine, paintings, statues. It's like, fine, give me a human. It's like, but wait a second, right? I can do wrong in not giving you $10, but not owe it to you to give you $10, right? It might do wrong because I made a promise to someone else to give you $10, okay? So it may be that my doing wrong has nothing in a way to do with my owing it to you, right? It might be that I owe it to someone else, right? Or maybe I don't owe it to anybody. Maybe I don't owe it to anybody, right? It could very well be that there's a way that I should treat you, but somehow I don't owe it to you, okay? Now, I say, oh, great, Murphy's about to give me a theory of what the difference is between having a duty to act in a certain way towards someone and having a duty to someone. I cannot do that. But neither can anybody else, okay? We don't have this yet, all right? People have been sort of taking their cracks at it. But what we have is, we have some seemingly clear cases. We have some differences between the two. We have some plausible necessary conditions that might make the difference, right? What we don't have is a full theory, right? Which is unfortunate. But I think I have enough to try to, in the ballpark, to sort of get at the worries that I have about this. Okay, so Thompson makes a distinction between, and this is what Mike was between what he calls monadic and bipolar normativity. This is the distinction between acting wrongly with respect to someone and wronging someone, right? So if I simply can act well or badly with respect to you, okay, that's monadic normativity. If I fail, the failure is in me, right? I'm morally criticizable or criticizable according to whatever normative standard is relevant. Okay. Interestingly, so Thompson points out, I think rightly, that the criminal law, right, is a matter of monadic normativity. Okay. Criminal law is about having a standard that you need to meet. You either meet it or you don't. If you don't meet it, you fail and you're guilty. Okay. By contrast, bipolar normativity connects the agent to a patient, right? And you can either be well or poorly related to the patient in virtue of your action. Okay. Tort law is an instance of bipolar normativity. In tort law, you owe duties of care to particular people, right? And if you fail to act with respect to your duty of care to those particular people, then you're required to pay compensation and so forth. Okay. Some people thought this is a way of getting a clue as to what bipolar normativity is all about. But there's a distinction between the two, right? And one way of thinking about it is that with monadic normativity, like in criminal law, there's such a thing as a victimless crime. You don't need to have because you don't need. But in tort law, there's no such thing as a victimless tort. Okay, it's like you can't commit a tort without there being somebody, right, that you're committing the tort against. There's a tortfeasor and a victim, okay? And there's got to be, because that's what the kind of normativity is. It relates the tortfeasor and the victim. Okay, so all the normative states of affairs regarding worship that I spent the first 25 minutes talking about, they all involve monadic normativity, right? What they said was, look, there's this being, incredibly fantastic being, incredibly great, right? And I ought to act in certain ways toward that being, right? I have reasons to conform my conduct in a certain way. And if I don't, I'm either failing to recognize a reason or whatever, reasons of certain kinds, or doing what's all things considered unreasonable. But that's all about me and my failure to respect that being's value, right? None of these, right, all by itself is enough to show that I have a directed duty to worship God, okay? You can't, because it's not in, bipolar normativity is not entailed by any set of monadic normativity states of affairs, okay? So no matter how much you turn the volume up on them, you're never going to get Owing, right? Just from the fact that you would act defectively if you act this way or don't act this way, okay? So the first point, right? First point is like, if you recognize a distinction here between bipolar normativity, Owing, directed duties, and these others, right? Then here's what you should allow. You should allow that even though one can be totally non-skeptical about the normative states of affairs I started with, you could still be very skeptical and wonder about whether or not we owe God worship, right? Is my relation to God and worship something like my relation to you under tort law not to run you over with my car, right? That if I run you over with my car, right, I haven't just screwed up, I've wronged you. I'm sorry, you're my victim. It's like, I've wronged you, okay? The question is it true that we wrong God by nature? It's true that we wrong God when we fail to worship God. Okay, well, like I said, this is where it would be super fantastic for me to like have a great theory of bipolar normativity, but I don't. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to make a different set of arguments, right? So I'm going to give three kinds of arguments that have made me kind of skeptical about the idea that we, by nature, owe God worship. Okay, so I call these the low road, the middle road, and the high road. Okay, the low road says, look, owing God worship is very different from other kinds of owing. Okay, and that gives us initial reason to be kind of skeptical about it. Okay, the second one is called the middle road. It appeals to a plausible necessary condition for owing people stuff, right? I want to say that we have some reason to think that we and God don't meet it. And finally, the high road. This is Anselmian reflection. It's supposed to be some kind of worries about tension between God's absolute perfection and the idea that we necessarily or by nature owe God worship. So let me talk about these sort of real quick. So here's the low road. And I don't put a lot of weight on the low road. I'm sorry, I'm totally mixing metaphors. I don't try to travel very far on the low road, right? It's like when I try to get my metaphor, but I do go a little way, right? Which something it's like, look, where do we find owing? Where's the paradigm place for us to find? It's in civil law and other kinds of social practices, okay? Games too, like we can owe it to allow the batter to go to whatever if they're a four ball. It's like we find owing in social practices like law, social customs, social conventions, games, and so forth, right? But that's a very, very long way from owing God worship by nature. These seem like very, very different. The paradigm location for owing, where we find it, is very, very far from where we're trying to locate it when we're talking about owing God worship, okay? And so I think you might look at that and go, boy, it would be kind of surprising if this showed up over there, okay? Given how straightforward and easy it is for us to locate owing over here, and why would we expect it to sort of show up over here as well, okay? You might think, well, Murphy, isn't it also true of obligation, that it also has a natural place here in civil law, but you were willing to say we're obligated to worship God? And I say, yeah, and we ought to be a little worried about it, okay? Just because it is true the natural home of obligation is in these social practices, so you have to do more work to try to show that the accountability relations that show up in social practices can also show up by nature, okay? I think that's work. I think it's work. That's why, anyway, I won't go there, but I think that is in fact work. And so I'm not saying there's like a different standard. I really do think you would have to give some extra effort to try to show, give us reason to believe that this thing that's paradigmatically has a home in social practices would also show up paradigmatically between us and God simply by nature. So further one moves, it's less plausible as that owing is realized. So here's the middle road. Here's a thought. Here's what I said. I'm appealing here to this idea of, maybe we don't have a great theory of bipolar normativity, but we have some ideas about what necessary conditions there are for it to be realized. So in order to get this across, I'm going to tell you a story that Thompson tells. it's a story about the Lombards and the Schlombards. Okay, so yes, it has to be Schlom. So here's this thought. It's a thought experiment that's meant to illustrate a basic point, which is that for bipolar normativity to be realized between two parties, it's not enough for them to be under a set of norms that have the common content, right? They also have to have a common source, okay? So here's this thought. This thought is like, imagine here are the Lombards on one side of the mountain and the Schlombards on another side of the mountain. And their legal systems are identical in their content. But one claims jurisdiction over the Lombards, the other only claims jurisdiction over the Schlombards. They meet at the top of a mountain and they try to make a contract, okay? What Thompson points out is they're going to be unable to do so, okay? Because they're not under a common set of norms, okay? The Lombards under Lombardy law, the Schlombard is under Schlombardy law. There is no common legal system over both the Lombards and the Schlombards that would make that contract between them come off, okay? It's really important if you and I make a contract that we're doing it under a set of rules under a common system of norms, okay? So his thought is that in order for beings to be tied together by way of bipolar normativity, they have to be under a common set of norms, subject to a common set of rules. And I think that we have reason to doubt that with respect to us and God. Okay, so one stronger way of putting it is to say, look, it's just false to say that God is subject to any normative system in the way that we're subject to a normative system. All right, we're under the rules of our particular legal systems. We're under the moral law. God's not subject to a set of norms in the same way. Okay, so if God's not subject to any set of norms at all, and we are, then how could we be bound together with God by way of bipolar normativity? Okay, maybe you think that argument stinks. Okay, maybe you say, maybe it's not true that God's constrained by a set of norms or whatever, but nevertheless, right? God's under a normative framework. Fine, whatever, if you want to put it that way. But look, here's what I'd say. But God's normative system is not ours. Okay, the normative system that we're under is one that's fixed for us due to our common nature as human beings. Okay, if you explain the moral law that we're under, part of the story of the moral law that we're under is that we're of a distinctive kind of being, human. Okay, but God isn't by nature a human being, even if God is now. It's like God isn't by nature a human being, and so I think we have reason to think that God and we are not under a common set of norms that would make it possible for us to be related to God by nature by way of bipolar normativity. Okay, here's the high road. The high road is Wu and Salmian thinking about absolute perfection. It's like, it's something like this. Look, do you really think it's plausible that an absolutely perfect being would necessarily be related to rational creatures in this way? Right? I mean, I assume that if by nature we're related by way of bipolar normativity to God, I suspect we would think that any rational being that God would create would be related by bipolar normativity to God. It's not like we're so special and some other rational beings wouldn't be, right? But do you want to say that an absolutely perfect being's discretion, right, of creation is limited such that any possible rational being that being created would be in relations of bipolar normativity to that being, right? I don't know. If you want me, I'll try to make it more vivid. Look, here's what I talked about. The law of torts generates the result as if there are tortfeasors and victims. Do you want to say that by nature we can victimize God? Because that's what it is for us to owe God worship, for us to owe God anything, right? If you have a directed duty towards some being, you have the capacity to make that being a victim. I don't think it's true that we by nature have that kind of power to make the absolutely perfect being a victim. So there's the view, right? So now you might go, oh, that's people worry about this, including people in this room have raised worries. It's like someone said, look, victimizing, you're playing on the notion of victimizing here. That might sound really bad, but look, there are two ways that basically the thought is like you're making it sound like we have the capacity to harm God by nature, the absolutely perfect being, but really, for victimization to happen, all that needs to happen is that we have to be able to violate God's rights, or something like that, right? Maybe I'm able to victimize you even without harming you by taking away something that rightfully belongs to you, even if it doesn't end up hurting you. And I can kind of see that, but I guess my thought is that characteristically, in cases where we can victimize someone without harming them, it presupposes the fact that we can harm them. right? That we can victimize people by attempting to harm them, even if we don't actually harm them. But that presupposes that we can harm them, right? So my thought is that it's not clear to me that there could be anything like rights by nature unless we have the capacity to harm the being who has these kinds of rights against us. And I just don't think we can harm God in that way. I don't think God's absolute perfection permits that. All right, so there are my reasons for skepticism. I'm just sort of worried about this idea. It strikes me that that we have kind of initial reason to be kind of skeptical of the idea. The other normative states of affairs don't entail it. It's far away from our paradigmatic cases in which we owe people things, and we can give some other sorts of reasons to be kind of suspicious of the idea that we owe God worship by nature. Now, so the people who've been skeptical about these other normative states of affairs about worship, their thought has been something like that it has a kind of skeptical implication, not just about worship, but about God, right? The thought is like, look, God is a being who's worthy of worship, right? So if there's no being that's worthy of worship, there is no God, right? And you might think, oh, does your view have similar skeptical implications about? I think not true. I just don't think it's true that the denial that we owe God worship by nature has any of these sort of skeptical implications about theism. In fact, I don't even think there are any really deep tensions between that view and theism itself, right? I don't see why. So one reason why I don't think it makes a difference is that I don't think the view it sort of derogates from the divine perfection in any way. I don't think that denying that we owe God worship in any way counts against God's being an absolutely perfect being. That would count against theism if that were true. Other views said if you deny that we have reason to worship God, I think that in a way involves kind of a denial of God's absolute perfection. Denies that God's exalted status is such that we have any reason to respond to it. That would kind of worry me a little bit. But I don't think I'm worried about the idea of our not owing God worship by nature, because I don't think it takes away anything from God. I don't think it takes away anything about God's absolute greatness. And of course, the fact that we don't owe God worship by nature, it's totally compatible with our actually owing God worship, right? So I do owe God worship, by the way. So it's like, this is not an argument why I don't have to worship God or I don't owe it to God to worship God. I do think I owe it to God to worship God, but I think it's a contingent matter. All right? I don't think it's something that's true by nature. If we say sort of how is that possible, right? How can we come to owe God worship by nature? It strikes me that the most plausible answers are gotten from asking, how is it that we owe each other things, right? Well, so one way we owe each other things is in virtue of contingent social practices that we share, right? So Scott and I are both under this legal system. That's a contingent fact, but that's what makes it true that Scott and I owe each other things under U.S. law, okay? But I also think it's true that we owe each other things simply by nature, right? And why would that be true? Well, maybe something like by sharing a common nature, okay? Just because both of us are human, that places us under a common law and makes it possible for us to owe each other things by way of bipolar normativity. Okay. My own thought is I think both of these can be ways for us to come to owe God stuff. Okay. So God did come to share our nature, and I think that probably does make a difference to what we owe God by entering into our human condition. How that works is like a great question, and it's way too hard for me to think about. So I'm not gonna. So I'm gonna make that go away, right? But here's something that's just a slightly less tractable. It's like by being under a common social practice, right? So if God were to enter our condition in just a social way, right, by establishing a legal order within which God's not just like the cause of its existence, but by actually having a role within that legal system, right? Some kind of divine law where God has a place, right? Then that would be a way in which we would be able to come. There would be a set of common norms that both we and God are subject to that would enable us to owe God things, including worship. I think that's actually happened. So I think it's possible. If you say, well, how does it happen? I don't know. I don't know how exactly it is that legal systems are able to do this, or rules of games, right? But it does seem like it's something that happens. So unless you want to deny that bipolar normativity is like something that happens, it looks like it could come to pass by God entering into our social condition in these ways. Okay, so I don't know what you think about that, and I'm looking forward to talking about this. But I want to end by talking about a kind of general worry, and I don't know. I don't know the best way to frame the worry. So let me just say these things. So my thought is that some folks will be bothered by the idea that some people owe God worship and others don't. And that maybe because God hasn't entered into the same social relationships with them or hasn't laid down the relevant norms that would make it true that they owe God worship. I don't know. Or some people, even if you think that God entered into our social condition in the way that such that everybody, in fact, owes God worship, maybe that's a possibility as well, they still might think there's something objectionable about the idea or something unsettling or unfortunate about the idea that we've come to be related to God, owing God worship in virtue of the sort of extra contingent set of facts about how God has entered into social relationships with us. So, the question is, like, is there something inherently problematic about some people owing God worship while some do not? Or, said in this alternative formulation, is there something inherently problematic about all of us owing God worship or coming to owe God worship in this kind of contingent way? Well, again, I don't think the problem is that it derogates from the divine greatness. I don't think that's the problem. I don't think it would in any way count against God's being great, that the way we come to owe God worship is contingently. But I wonder whether some folks might have the idea that it somehow is a bummer for us. Right? There's something unfortunate about this sort of extra condition of having this kind of extra normative burden laid upon us. Maybe it's not laid upon other people, right? We come to owe a duty to God that other folks don't have. But in any case, whether that strikes you as sort of a worry or not, I want to just sort of point out something that I think is kind of attractive about the picture that I've described. Okay, see if you like the way it's put too. So, my view is that coming under a duty to worship God, duty to God to worship God, coming to owe God worship, is actually this amazingly joyous, beneficial thing. Okay, so even if it's true, so what I'm saying is, like, I want to say there's something really attractive about the picture in which, as a matter of just nature, our response to God is that of an absolutely perfect being that we ought to respond to positively, right? And that as this further thing that happens, we come to owe God worship, right? I think that's fantastic, okay? And here's why I think it's fantastic. Let me make it explicit. The first thing is that what makes it fantastic is that this is another kind of intimacy with God that in a way can't be taken for granted, right? So, so when people talk about intimacy with God, I think what we typically focus upon are various kinds of volitional and cognitive intimacy. Sharing a mind with God, coming to will the things that God wills, and so forth, right? But while this is true like in the way that we relate to other people and come into intimate relationships with them, right? But I think it's true, I think it's interestingly true, that this is not the only way we come into intimate relationships with other human beings, right? Not just volitionally, not just cognitively, but also normatively, right? Like, one thing we do to enter into close relationships with people is by forming normative connections with them. Tying ourselves together with promises, right? Families marrying, becoming tied by marriage through normative bonds. Coming to owe each other things. Friendships in which we come to owe each other new things as a result of our relationships, okay? So one thought is, like, don't take owing God worship for granted as just part of, like, part of, like, the right kind of response to have what's great, right? It's that in owing God worship, we come to be related more intimately to God, right? As someone to whom we can give what is owed or fail to give what is owed, right? So I think that's a really good thing. I think it's an attractive feature of the picture, that this is one more way in which intimacy with God is a not to be taken for granted thing. That nevertheless God has chosen to make possible for us. Right? So that's one thing. Here's the second thing. The second thing is that it seems to me that one thing one might think about worship and owing God worship is that it's normatively unburdening rather than burdening. Okay? So let's take just a minute for me to explain this. So it's like, again, no one has a great theory of what it is to owe people directed duties, right? But here's one, like, really, really plausible idea. One of them is that when you owe someone else a directed duty, the counterparty, the one you owe a duty to, has discretion, right, about how to weight the duty that you have toward that person. Okay, how much weight to give? Maybe within reason. Maybe there's some limits here. But so here's like what does that mean? Maybe something that's like, look, suppose you've promised to bring someone lunch today. They're working, and you promised. It's like, if you owe it to them, right? You might think part of what it is that you owe it to them is that that person has discretion about how weighty that duty should be for you, right? They can't make it a matter of life and death for you, by the way. Okay, that's going to be within reason. But it's like, it could be that that they can make it such that if you had some significant obstacle to get it, they can say, don't worry about it. You don't need to do it, right? Or they could insist upon it, right? If you're willing to, if you're trying to like shuffle it off or whatever. It's like, part of it is it gives them a certain role in structuring your normative requirements. They have some authority, right, about how weighty or those reasons will be for you, right? Now, so here's the thought. The thought is like, if that's really true, if that's really what's involved in owing someone something or having a directed duty to them, then part of what it means for us to owe God worship is that God now has or would have upon discretion about how heavily to weight the requirements of worship that we're under with respect to God. Okay? And to me, I find that deeply normatively unburdening. Okay? Here's why. It's like, I don't know about y'all, but like when I think about worship, I form two thoughts. One's about vagueness. I go, oh my gosh, like it's so indeterminate about how much I should be worshiping God. It's like, I don't know the reasons for and against. It seems very, very hard. There seems like incommensurability involved and so forth. It seems very, very vague, right? That's one thought I have. I also have this other probably incompatible thought, which is something like, I should be worshiping all the time. This should be like the dominant thing that I should like stop to eat and then get back to it, right? Because if like God is the absolutely perfect being, right, then why shouldn't I be doing this like as much as possible, right? And the thought, so it's like, am I just displaying my anxieties? I don't know, but the thought is like, look, but if it's a duty you owe to God, right, God can tell you how it is that you're supposed to carry out that duty, right? God can fix for you by determining what would count as adequate worship, right? Maybe God has other things for you that God would rather you be doing on some occasions, right? Maybe God, and it doesn't have to be the same for all people, right? Maybe some people have a vocation to spend more time doing the kinds of actions that are characteristic of worship. Other folks have reason to go out and do things that are in some ways incompatible with the super, super rich worship life that other folks have, right? But in any case, right, the thought would be that instead of thinking of coming to owe God worship as like one more requirement that's laid on our back, that's not the right way to think about it. Coming to owe someone something is not one more requirement laid upon them. It's entering into a new kind of relationship with them, right? And that new kind of relationship is one that both has a kind of value in itself and can be valuable with respect to the way that you carry out what you have good reason to do. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Now we're going to enter the Q&A period. We're going to go until 5:45, no later, or until questions die out. So put your hand up. I'll call on you and write you down.
Okay, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I have a question which is connected with your definition by nature.
Yeah.
So first of all, maybe I'm not sure if I understood it, because you're defining here, I think the defining characteristic is without having to be imposed. So I was wondering, later you say, how do we come to owe God worship? By being under a common social practice. But being under could also be understood as being imposed, and just society has certain social practices. So,
yeah.
Well, this may be more a comment, or maybe something I haven't understood right. And the other thing is more a worry or a question about, does your ought here by nature, does it derive from an is, an ontological is, or not? Because maybe my naive view is just to say, well, by nature, I would understand I owe someone by nature, or I owe God by nature, because I'm a creature. So
yeah.
He has given me something or everything.
Yeah.
Gifts and so on, but especially also existence, which enters my very being or what I receive from God. So it's just by nature. It just means because He's creator and I'm a creature. So this would mean that just that I owe Him something by nature, and this would apply to anyone.
Yeah.
So this is maybe just a naive view. just wondering. I think this would solve a couple of problems with this social practice approach.
Yeah. So, so let me say something about what I meant by nature, and then I'll say a few unsatisfactory things about creature and creator. So, so the by nature thing was not supposed to be. It's two conditions, not one, right? So one thought would be. So one of the thoughts was about the characteristic circumstances of human action, and the other was about not being imposed, right? So the idea was just this: is that the only thing I sort of meant, the only thing I sort of was meaning by this was that we can't take simply from the fact of like the ordinary environment of the human being, right, that we would be under this requirement with respect to God. That's the first thing. Now, if someone says, well, wait a second, I think it's part of the ordinary situation of the human being that God has like somehow imposed some extra further normative requirement on us by some act of authority or whatever. I say, no, I don't think I want to count that. Right? What I want to talk about is whether or not it's true simply in virtue of a kind of this sort of necessary non-further authoritative imposition, whether it's true that we have under this sort of bipolar normativity. That's right. So that's what I want to say about that. So the question about God and creature and so forth. I don't have any sort of big things to say about is and ought, but maybe I could say something about God, God and creature. So I do recognize that this is a very common view, right? The thought is, oh, so I can explain to you why we owe God worship, right? We owe God worship because God created us, right? And then if I say, well, why does that matter? Maybe there's a story about gratitude, or I don't know what you want to say, or it's a display of God's greatness or something like that, right? And I sort of nod my head at all that, right? And I say, okay, this might give me excellent reason to recognize the greatness of God, right? Acknowledge how fortunate I am, or something like that, right? But what I'm asking is, right? It's like, but should I think that what this means is that I owe God something, right? Now, if you say, well, it's sort of obvious, right? I want to say, no, it's not obvious. Creature and created. I mean, here's one way of thinking about it: is that owing someone something is a very specific kind of social relationship, is my thought, and I don't think that creator and creature is a very special kind of social relationship. I don't think it's a social relationship at all. It's a causal relationship. If you want to say that God's having created us, it just is a social relationship between us and God, I think that's a mistake. I think I understand the thought. God would not have created unless God wanted to enter into a certain kind of social relationship with us. I understand that thought, but I agree. I don't agree with it, but I don't think it's plausible to think that a merely causal relationship is itself a social one. So in a way, I want to say, I guess my thought is like, I think it's a mistake to transfer thoughts that we have about the kind of gratitude or whatever that we owe each other in the context of ordinary human social life. I think it's a mistake to transfer that to the case of the relationship between us and God. I think they're very different kinds of relationships. And the sort of gesturing I was doing toward low road, middle road, and high road, there were also to be reasons to sort of unsettle us and think, maybe this isn't the right kind of framework for us to think about the kind of normative requirements that we have with respect to God. Thanks.
Susan?
So I have two questions, and I think the first one is just quick and easy, so that's why I'm allowing myself to, but if it ends up taking a while, then I'll.
Okay.
So the quick one I thought was just a question about your divide and conquer strategy.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering about whether they were compatible if you adopted strategy 2 of your part 2.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know how you captured the fittingness thing, if the object of the attitude is just derivative on. But then in the strategy 2, then the object of the attitude is that.
Yeah. No. So I think I could try to talk about. I'll try to make this very short. So I think that it would be a mistake if I took strategy 2 and then I said that the attitudes were like wholly reducible to a disposition to perform that action. Yeah, right. So the thought would be something like there's something about, I know that makes me kind of uncomfortable because it seems kind of very hybrid-y and so forth, right? But the thought would maybe be something like, look, this one sort of value calls for both an attitudinal and an actional response, and the action one isn't entirely derivative of the other, right? Why they sort of go together? Yeah, that makes me antsy. But yeah, that's what I would. Yeah, but it would not be. It wouldn't be incompatible. But you're right. I think you're right. If I did the whole degree, it would be incompatible.
Okay. So the other question I had was just. So I don't have this sense that I disagree. I don't know about this, so it's not that it's an objection or something. But I'm unmoved by the high road, and I'm thinking if you're calling it the high road, you must want to put all the weight on that one.
No. It just means this kind of airy feeling to me. It's like when you start doing like Anselmian stuff, you say,
you're not going to travel very
absolutely, no, yeah.
And
No.
I guess maybe the way I could put the reason why I just don't feel moved by it is I can't quite understand. I mean, I share the intuition I can't harm God, everyone, like all of that, but I can't really see like what do you mean by harm besides like failing to give what's due. And then I think, yeah, we could fail to give God what's due.
Yeah. So.
That doesn't strike me as a
So I mean, not all. I mean, harm. I mean, so I disagree with that notion of harm. I mean, I think of to me, to harm someone to set back their interests, and then it's a further question whether or not one is giving them what is their due when you harm them, right? So I think I think it's an open question whether or not. Harming someone is sometimes giving them their due. It's like they deserve to be harmed, or harming them this particular way. Or right. So, but the thought. So my thought is like. My view is that the notion of harm in terms of something like setting back one's. I mean, they're like hard questions like interest and perfection. It's like to set back a being's interests or perfection or something like that. I think that's what harm is, right? And I think that, characteristically, when we start thinking about what's due to people, we take for granted a background notion of this would count as harming them, right? And so it's not what's due to them, right? Because they're otherwise good and whatever. Right? And then when there are questions where someone has done something where they maybe have forfeited their right not to be harmed in these ways, or they merit it retributively or something like that, we say, well, maybe they should be harmed, right? Or maybe you disagree with that, but it's like that's not at that point it's like a live normative question what one should do, right? So that's why I'm thinking. My thought is that if questions of due-ness in that way are posterior to questions of harm, then God's being unharmable by us would make it very strange that God's by nature. We could deprive God of what's God's due. And I know that sounds really weird. In part because I'm sorry, I'm continuing talking. It's like, in one way we talk about giving someone what's their due just in responding to the way they ought to be responded to, right? You ought to do that with God. Right? You ought to worship. I mean, you ought to worship God, right? You ought to respond to God's greatness in the way that characteristic of worship, right? But if you say, well, if you don't do it, you're not giving God what's God's due. I say, well, do you mean it just in responding properly, or do you think that you owe it to God? I say, no, I don't think you owe it to God. At least not by nature. I do now, but there could have been a very different. I mean, I don't know if people believe this or not. They're not going to believe it. There could have been a very different history of creation in which God was not interested in relating to us at all in the ways that God has. In which case, we wouldn't owe God anything, and God wouldn't owe us. God wouldn't owe us anything. It's because God chose to enter into this kind of social relationship with us. And even if you don't believe that, but it still could be true that it's because of the social thing that we come to owe, even if God inevitably entered into that social relationship. That's the view, anyway. Thanks.
Greg?
Oh, hi, Greg. I said you in the back room. Hi. Well, thank you.
I'm trying to figure out how to frame this question. Maybe a big part of my question had to do with the way you framed it at the beginning, all around attitudes, and then at one point you had this little verbal slip, and you said disposition, and I couldn't tell what's the difference between attitude and disposition.
Yeah.
I guess my bigger question is, it seemed like that was actually doing a lot of work in the paper in the following way.
course paper in a way, so here's what's behind my question. Kierkegaard's works of love, structured like this, almost the whole of the work is a meditation on this line from the gospel, right? Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself.
Yeah.
Reflects on that for hundreds of pages. But then at the very end of the book, it switches and reflects on this other line from John's first letter. Let us then love one another. It seemed like your paper did something very similar, that there was this language of duty and language of owing, and at the end, it's all relational. And I really like that. It seems to me the disposition changes, and you maybe brought your reader to a place where you find your interlocutor in one place where maybe thinking about this in terms of duty and owing is the right way to think about it. But at the end of the day, that's not the right attitude or disposition or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't know if I'm gonna get at what you're. I'm not entirely sure. So yeah, I'm trying to think where I like need where you're right. It may have just been a slip where I sort of need the language of disposition. So right, it's what I said. Maybe the attitude is simply disposition. Susan called me out on that and said that wouldn't be compatible with the earlier view. And I said, yeah, that's right. That's not the right way to think about it. Yeah, I don't know how much of what I said depends on that bit of it. One thing that I'm hearing coming through is like there's all this talk about duty and obligation and so forth, and there's all that sort of relationality bit. But I guess my thought is that if you don't like it framed in terms of duty and so forth, it can do most of the talk in terms of just what should we do? How should we respond to God? What response does God's value call for from us, right? And I think I could say everything, like the initial part of the paper, in the much less duty, sounding ways, right? It's like, what should we do? What does it call for from us? And are we accountable for this, right? I think that's everything I want to say. I would say in those terms. But I do think, there is a change of tone at the end of the paper, right? Because I do think that the thought of it's the thought of us owing God things, right? I think, and that being like an additional normative burden that we're sort of being placed under. It makes it, again, it sounds like a burden. It sounds like some sort of this bad thing being added to us. But my thought is that many of the normative ties that we're under, we do not conceive that way. We do think of them as valuable. That even if many of the other features of our lives were otherwise unaffected, we would still value the fact that we're tied to other people in certain ways. And if that's right, then we shouldn't. We shouldn't let the fact that we owed God, however we conceive it as by nature or not, we shouldn't let the fact that we owe worship to God be something that's either conceived of as a burden or something that sort of just slips into the background because it's something that just holds by nature. We should sort of treasure it, right, as just one more form of relationality that's available between us creatures and God, if it's realized. No, please.
Everything I'm saying tracks along with what you're saying, but maybe you didn't see this part of what I'm saying. There's a point in which our dispositions aren't lined up with what you said there.
Yeah.
And there, when we're in a spot, there, the language of duty and owing is actually helpful for us to get us in a certain kind of habit.
Yeah.
Where now, once you become habituated to act in this sort of way, then you can shift from owing to let us. So. Oh yeah.
I see. I think I'm seeing a little better.
Thou shalt love. Thou shalt love. Thou shalt love.
Right.
Let us love. So I heard you say to yours, thou shalt worship. Thou shalt worship.
Yeah.
Let us worship.
Good.
And there, all of a sudden, we're able to make the move because the kind of habituation that comes from we were in the sort of wrong state before. Now
You're right. So this is absolutely right. There's nothing in this paper about like the virtues, and so it's like there's nothing about sort of the way in which worshipfulness, right? The kind of standing hat where it's second nature, or however you want to put it, and sort of how nothing of that shows up in this paper. That's absolutely right. And it's also right that I was pushing on it on the sort of the positive side of coming into the relationship. But you're also, it's also right that there's great value to the demandingness side of it, right? So I was saying, when you've got a directed duty, it's the person has the discretion to fix the nature, right? And that sounds, and I said, and that can be sort of normatively unburdening. But it's also true that it can be demanding, right? It's like when if I'm under an obligation to you, if I owe a duty to you, right? I start slacking off. I stop appreciating you. It's like a great thing about it is that you can call me to account, right? It's like you have standing to hold me to the more demanding version of it, right? Hoping that my ways will change, or hoping that I'll see the light, or whatever. So it's right. I think it's true that there are multiple ways you can think about the sort of the positive effects of this kind of relationality. They're more positive in a way the better the party with whom you have the relationship, right? So the fact that it's God that you come under this sort of duty should make you sort of happy, right, about the prospects of it, even at its sort of most demanding and chafing.
Scott. Thanks. This is really interesting. I think what I want to ask is really a question about how you're understanding obligation.
Yeah.
So I want to try to think through an example for a second and see how you would think about this case. This is just a case of, like, imagine Robinson Crusoe, he's on his island, you're never going to meet him, okay?
Yeah.
So the two of you are socially isolated from each other.
Okay.
What do you want to? So you don't have an obligation to him, and is it your view that you do not have obligations to him, given that you're never going to share?
Okay. I'm sorry. So let's. I want to make sure I understand the case. All right. So the case is like
you're on one island and he's on another,
and I don't know of his existence, or I do.
You don't know of it.
I don't know of his existence. Yeah. Right. Okay. And the question is, do I have any obligations with respect to this person? Any obligations with respect to this person? Yeah. So one thing that makes it I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to try to get at what your real. So one thing that makes it puzzling is that there's all these questions about what you say about how our obligations are affected by ignorance. So it's like a kind of a hard. That makes it kind of hard. So we want to say. So it's like there's like a word. But put it aside. So I want to say, yeah, of course, right. So if it turns out that somehow you figured out, even though you have no that there's very likely this person on this other island, right? Or you think, I don't know whether there is or not, but if I did this one little thing, if there was someone on the other island, I could prevent that person from being killed by a tidal wave, whatever. You get the. We're doing island scenarios here, right? So it's like coral reef won't dissolve or whatever, right? Okay. I want to say, sure, you have an obligation, right? But the explanation would be something like this. So it's like I gave sort of two possible views on this. One is that one way to explain the difference between obligation and other kinds of just straight rational requirement is that it's not just that it's only if the rational requirement is generated by certain kinds of reasons, like reasons of the value of persons. That might make it morally obligatory. Or so that would be an explanation. It would be, the reason why you're under an obligation, right? Maybe I'm under a rational requirement not to eat too much coconut milk or drink too much coke because it makes me sick, right? But maybe I'm not morally obligated to do this, right? But if it's someone else and some other, I would have an obligation because of the reasons, right? But on this accountability worry, right? I think that's the more serious question. It's like, well, if you have this sort of accountability view, what do you want to say? If it's true that no one will ever hold you accountable, no one knows of you to hold you. It's like, I think the typical thought is something like, they don't want to make, the question is whether or not this is a motivated view, they don't want to make whether you're obligated a result of some sort of fluky contingent factor. So it's a matter of like standing rather than whether they happen to be in any position to call you on it, right? So the thought would be, look, you know, if think about it this way, it's like if you knew that you could affect this, that you could very, very likely affect someone's well-being by doing this, even if you never met the person or whatever, right? They're not likely ever to hold you to account. If they met you 10 years from now after a miraculous rescue, right? They would have reason, hey, why didn't you help me out, right? Just because they have the standing, it's just that they were prevented from exercising it due to the flukiness of the circumstances.
Well, so that's related to what was really,
okay.
What made me think of the scenario was counterfactuals.
Yeah.
So you may never actually be in a social relation with Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah.
But what I wonder about is whether somebody could say, but it is true of you that if you wound up on the same island,
yeah,
that you would have certain obligations and have probably just in virtue of his
yeah.
humanity or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So what I wonder if like you and the person who thinks that we owe God worship by nature are maybe just defining, because I think that you would both agree that there's something thicker that happens in virtue of God entering into social relations with us.
Yes.
Something thicker and richer there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think the person who says we owe God worship by nature might be thinking sort of like, well, we are of such a nature that if God enters into relation socially with us, then we get that richer thing. And that's what we mean by saying by our nature. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do see. I see. So I'm really suspicious of that maneuver. In part because I want to say that it's not just any social relationships. For one thing, it's like it's got to be those that are of the right kind to generate this sort of bipolar normativity, right? And so it's like, well, we have examples of these, but it wouldn't just be like any relationship that God happened to choose with us, right? And I also want to say that it's. So here's what I want to say: I'm right and they're not, right? It's that the fact that there's some conditional of the form if X, then there will be bipolar normativity, is not itself the claim that there's bipolar normativity. It's like that's just I think so. It would be like saying so maybe me and. So maybe I and someone on the other side of the world have no legal obligations to each other because we're under different legal systems, right? So here's the truth. If we got together and formed a legal system, then we would be under this. But the basic truth is we do not have these obligations to each other, right? And the fact that we can specify the circumstances on which it would come to pass, right? That doesn't change the fact that there are no such things, right? Yeah. So my thought is like there's that if they want to say this, I could agree with a lot of what they said, but I would say the point about not owing still would hold. Thanks.
Yeah, so just a quick follow-up, then I'll ask another question. Standard move in the essence literature.
In the what?
Standard move in the essence literature
Essence.
goes as follows. Socrates is essentially human, comes out true. But wait, there are worlds Socrates doesn't exist. Is that a problem for the claim that Socrates is essentially human?
Right.
No, because what we mean is there's an implicit restriction to the world's reasonable individual. So
Yeah.
I'll still get what I meant by it's essential to Socrates that he's human by making the retrieving claim for Socrates to exist that he would instantiate humanity.
Yeah.
So I mean, it looks like that sort of response puts you in deep tension with a lot of the pressures that essence theorists face.
I'm not tracking you. I'm sorry. So what's my worry?
Typically, essentialists will be very happy to say it's not the case that the fact that it's essential to Socrates that he's human guarantees that Socrates exists.
Yeah.
Similarly, you might say that like it might be essential to God that he deserves worship, sort of even in cases wherein we're not in worlds where he stands in relevant relations to human beings, because there's an implicit restriction.
What's the restriction? I guess I don't know how this turns out that I'm not denying something that other people are affirming, right? So they're affirming that the fact, I take it that what they're affirming is something like the fact that that God is that we owe God, that rational beings owe God worship is not in virtue of God standing in some non-necessary social relationship with them.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying is false, right? So it's like it's not just a matter of, I mean, I can see sort of how the restriction moves work, but I don't think how it does enough to make me not denying what they want to affirm.
Okay. Here's like a case, you can tell me what's wrong about it.
Okay. Maybe I can't.
So
it often happens I can't.
Let's assume a relationship of mere biological parentage.
Yeah.
So someone is just the mere contributor of certain genetic information.
Yeah.
So someone's like a mere sperm donor, let's say.
Yeah.
It looks like we can imagine circumstances where this is rational normative phenomenology. Person finds out that like the father doesn't know.
Mm-hmm.
They in fact become a biological father.
Yeah.
This is like kept hidden for various reasons. They might enter into discussions with people and make claims of the following: I really ought to let him know about me.
Mm-hmm.
And then people might pressure them and ask for reasons. And then later on in the conversation, we might imagine it being felicitously uttered that he deserves to know that much.
Yeah.
And it looks like we can straightforwardly move from Confucian's like, I ought to let him know and he deserves that much to he's owed that much.
Yeah.
So it looks like we're getting transitions from the monadic situation, the constructions where we're attributing de re normative properties to constructions where we are attributing de re normative properties. And moreover, this is holding in sort of the case where there's no imposition of a socially significant relation.
Yeah.
Because like having contributed genetic information isn't going to count as appropriately social on like all the view of socially imposed role.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you thought that this would be a case that pressured some of the communities that you're.
Yeah. So my view is not that we never appropriately move from claims of monadic normativity to bipolar. It would be something like this. It would be that it assumes a bipolar premise in the background, right? So I mean, it's like the no ought from is. It's like you got to have some suppressed ought premise in there. Is the claim. So the claim would be something like if we're talking about you say, oh, this person needs this because it would really be important for furthering this child's interests or something like that. I take it the assumed normative background is cases in which human beings, ceteris paribus, blah blah blah, owe it to each other not to do things that will not to do things that will set back their interests. Okay. Now, if you say what makes it true that human beings owe these kinds of things to each other, I think that's a really great question for normative theory, right? It looks like it'd be something like, well, it can't be just because of sharing some contingent social relationship with each other, because I think I can owe it to people on the other side of the world that I'm in no social relationship with at all. I would assume it's something about sharing a common nature with them that makes it the case that I'm bound to them in this way, even though we're not in any such contingent relationship, right? So that's why my thought is like that. And this is just, again, this is nothing that I'm arguing from the ground floor up, right? It seems to me that there are two places. Like a general background thing, I'm in like almost everything I do in like moral philosophy that's connected with philosophy of religion, something like, I kind of assume that I kind of get our morality, sort of like and I can happy to sort of take it as a datum. And one thing that I think is, well, here's what look like data. Here's what look like data to me. I can owe things to other people in virtue of social relationships, and I can just owe it to other people in virtue of our common human nature. Right, and I say those are the two things that I'm pretty confident about, right? And I don't think either of those hold by nature with respect to us and God. So I go, the two things that seem like it makes it possible for me, I just don't see it with respect to God. But nicely, both of those sort of make it possible for us to owe stuff to God, because God can come to share our nature and God can enter into social relationships with us. But they wouldn't generate the result that we can just go from one to the other. Thanks.
So we have 7 minutes left and 7 more days of the week.
It's the lightning round. Right.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Murphy, very much. I had a question about the middle road objection, just the idea that we don't share a normative framework with God.
Yeah.
And piggybacking on what Patrick said, you said something to the effect of, well, he rather said that because God produced us, that we somehow have normative, like some kind of obligations to him. You replied that causal relations don't imply necessarily social relations. Yeah. And I was also thinking of parenthood.
Yeah.
And think of, like begetting a child.
Yeah.
You ought de facto, like, giving birth to the child or being responsible for the child's birth. Yeah. You might think that you have social obligations already, like supervening on that almost. Yeah. So in that case, God created us, and just like as a son or daughter has obligation, filial, to, obligations to their parents, then we might have the same thing to God. Yeah. And secondly, just real quickly, the high road objection, I was wondering if that could be used as an objection to you saying at the end how we could have obligations to God through the incarnation, because God thereby shares a common humanity or we're in the same society as him. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could address this.
Yeah, so real quick. So the first thing I want to say is that, so I don't think of mere biological parenthood as a social relationship, though it might make it true that you ought to have a social relationship and so forth, right? But so like, I actually think it's like a really interesting question about sort of how all these requirements get generated. But I'll just say, if so, it's because it's not about the social relationship; it's about the sharing of the kind. It's that it's going to be something like it's a truth about our kind that those who in standard conditions, those who procreate owe this to their offspring. So I would say because it's a kind, relevant truth, I don't think it applies to God directly. So about the high road and incarnation. Yeah, I mean, so I think my thought is that I think the kinds of complicated questions that are going to arise about this are going to be complicated questions that arise for the incarnation generally, about how it's possible for a being to be, as they say in Talladega Nights, it's like little baby Jesus can't say a word but still omnipotent. It's like yeah, wow, how's that possible? It's like, how is it true that, yes, you can victimize God because you can put God on a cross, right? But on the other hand, this being is still all bad. So I think, and I literally, this is like what I love to spend like the next 10 years on, is like thinking about what happens when you have beings of two different, one being with two natures under two different normative frameworks like that. That's really complicated. It's a different question than the metaphysical question, but I think it's just as interesting.
Thanks, Mark. So I was interested, just to keep it as quick as I can, I was interested in the sort of details of your contingent obligation conclusion, and specifically I was wondering, I'm assuming you wanted to keep the ideas of attitudes and actions. Yeah. But so I was wondering if the derivativeness of one on the other, whichever way you wanted to go, attitudes or actions, whether one being derivative on the other would affect the nature of the contingency at play. And if the last part is just, if a way out of that would be to say, well, look, we have contingent obligations to have certain attitudes, and we have contingent obligations to perform certain actions, and they're independent of one another because they lead to different forms of intimacy with God.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So, that's a great proposal. I don't know exactly what to think about it, but I do think. I do think that it's. This is totally going to be totally unsatisfactory. It's like, I do agree that whatever story one ends up fixing early on about the relationship between the attitudes and the actions in worship will make a difference to sort of what we owe to God and what's likely to be imposed contingently, or both what in terms of what God's going to demand of us in terms of worship if we enter this sort of normative condition with respect to God. I'm perfectly happy. I would say I'm perfectly happy with the idea that we could owe God certain attitudes as a matter of. That's the idea. Some people get worried about that. I don't worry about that at all. The idea that I might owe certain attitudes toward my children or whatever doesn't bug me in the least. I don't see why it would be a problem with respect to God either. But I do think you're right. Though I don't have more to say to you right now than the fact that different ways of trying to explain the rational requiredness of these will make a difference in sort of how we should, the shape we should expect the contingent form of worship required of us to take. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Mark. Great talk. I also want to go back to the high road and try to be quick. So I take it that if we want to attack the high road, one way to do it is to just go straight for trying to make sense of this thought that rational creatures by nature have the capacity to make God a victim.
Yeah.
And so you just mentioned one way that we really have made God a victim.
Yeah.
Views.
Yeah.
So you might think that that is baked into the nature, sort of through God's creative act, that makes us with that nature to fulfill some purpose, right? And I know it sounds like you don't want to go this way, don't like this kind of view, but you might think there are certain kinds of goods, relational goods perhaps, inventorily valuable goods that are uniquely realized in relationships that overcome things like hatred, enmity, hostility.
Yeah.
And you might think that realizing them is sort of an appropriately great-making accomplishment for a God who is identified with love, right? So you could think, I was thinking, like in scriptures it talks about, so like 1 Peter and Revelation both talk about the lamb that was slain from the foundation, or foreordained, right? This kind of deep necessity. Before anything happens, before the fall, there's a kind of deep necessity. Sounds like, or like maybe only Providence, but something that requires Christ's death. And so you might think if it's sort of baked into, if it's like an essential feature of God or something, then it makes sense that we're created with the nature to be rational creatures capable of victimizing God.
Oh yeah. Right. So my thought was the very, very simple thought that part of Anselmian perfection would involve a kind of invulnerability to setback, right? And so I mean, even if it were true that this was our capacity to harm God was somehow set from the beginning of it all, right? The thought would be, well, you better come up with a way of doing it that doesn't just involve, harming this being that's perfect by nature. You would need something like taking on a creaturely nature, or somehow being able to be harmed by entering into our social condition or something like that, where in some manner of speaking, what's due to them can be taken away, right? So for me, it's about the demands of Anselmianism, which I know that some people want to say. Some people want to say, even if you're Anselmian, you should think that God can have God's interest set back in some way. I don't buy it. I don't buy it, and I think the Anselmian should just deny that this is at all possible.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so let's thank our speakers.
Oh my gosh, thank you guys. Thanks so much. That was really fun. Thanks. Cheers.